Authentic is sponsored in whole by Voice of Prophecy.
Ever find yourself doing something that you don't really want to do, but for some reason you feel kind of powerless and you just do it anyway? Or maybe it's something that makes you feel ashamed, out of control, but you know full well this won't be the last time you do it. Today on Authentic, I'm going to show you the big hidden beast that's been causing all your problems.
Welcome to Authentic. Sean Boonstra explores real existential questions about the meaning of your life and how you can live a genuine human existence. Listen every week right here on this station or on your favorite podcatcher. Here's Sean with this week's episode of Authentic.
Indulge me for a moment and let's play a little mind game. I want you to think back to some significant experience in your life and allow yourself to feel the emotions you felt at that time all over again. Maybe it was something that made you angry, or maybe it was something tragic that gave you overwhelming sadness. Something made you cry. Something made you laugh. Something made you seize up with panic. Whatever it was, take a quick moment and just let it play out in your mind one more time, and I'll give you just a few seconds to do that. All right. Hopefully that gave you enough time to dig around in your memory to find something fairly significant. Here's what I want you to notice about this. It was some kind of external stimulus that made you feel that way. So let's say you were thinking about something that really made you angry. What happened to cause that? It was some kind of trigger from outside your own mind that provoked an emotional response. You didn't consciously decide to get angry. You didn't sit down and reason your way into that emotion using your logic. Something else made you mad. And when it happened, you didn't seem to have a lot of control. The same thing happens when you cry. Let's say you're watching old home movies and you suddenly see your kids the way they were 20 years ago and it moves you. You suddenly realize that the incredible experiences of early childhood are now gone forever, and it provokes this feeling of loss. So again, it was an external stimulus that provoked an emotional response, and you couldn't seem to help yourself. When something funny happens, you laugh. You didn't plan to laugh, and if you've ever been asked to laugh on cue, say as part of a TV audience, you know that forced laughter doesn't sound at all like the real thing. It's an autonomic reaction, something you do without thinking. It comes from a place of automatic instinct, not from a place of careful deliberation and reason. And the more you pay attention to this, the more you start to realize that most of your day-to-day living operates at a basic level of instinct. You don't plan to breathe, even though you can breathe deliberately for a few minutes. You don't plan to blink, even though you can force yourself to do that for a few minutes. You don't plan to jump when somebody scares you. It all happens subconsciously. So here's the problem that presents for the average human being. Over the centuries, we've managed to convince ourselves that we're mostly rational, that we live a very deliberate existence. We craft our lives through the power of our reason. But in hindsight, as you look back over the major events of your life, you start to realize that even though you did make a number of rational choices, and you occasionally did control your destiny, you were mostly carried forward by unseen forces, things that appear to be beyond your control. This is where philosophers have spent a lot of time debating whether or not you and I actually have free will. Are you really the master and commander of your life, or is your life the master and commander of you? I mean, tell yourself all you want that you're not going to get mad when you're negotiating with somebody unreasonable, but you know you're going to get mad. And it's going to take real effort to control that emotion, the basic forces that drive you, because, well, emotions are such a powerful part of who you are. I'm half tempted to quote REO Speedwagon. You know the song, "I Can't Fight This Feeling," but I'm pretty sure you wouldn't want to hear me sing. I guess the point I'm driving at is this. There's a reason we feel like we have to fight our basic emotions. It's because they are much bigger and much stronger than our capacity for calm reason and logic. The best-selling psychologist Jonathan Haidt compared this basic instinctual part of your brain to a really powerful elephant. And he said that your logical brain is like a tiny little jockey, a little rider sitting on the elephant trying to tell it where to go. And at the end of the day, the elephant is going to do what the elephant is going to do because he's bigger and stronger. This is the reason it's so hard to convince people to change their minds, even with a carefully reasoned argument. You might be able to persuade them logically. That is, you might be able to convince the tiny rider on the elephant that you're right. But the elephant is much stronger, and things like intuition or emotion will almost always override your sense of logic. So what actually happens when we hear something that we don't like is that we use that weakling logic on top of the elephant to convince ourselves that that powerful elephant of emotion must be right. Let me read you just a little bit from his book, The Righteous Mind. He says, the rider can do several useful things. It can see further into the future because we can examine alternative scenarios in our head, and therefore it can help the elephant make better decisions in the present. It can learn new skills and master new technologies, which can be deployed to help the elephant reach its goals and sidestep disasters. And most important, the rider acts as the spokesman for the elephant, even though it doesn't necessarily know what the elephant is really thinking. The rider is skilled at fabricating post hoc explanations for whatever the elephant has just done, and it is good at finding reasons to justify whatever the elephant wants to do next. Once human beings developed language and began to use it to gossip about each other, it became extremely valuable for elephants to carry around on their backs a full-time public relations firm. So I'm sure you can remember a few times that you were having an argument with somebody and you kind of knew you were wrong, but then these deep-seated emotions pushed all your pride buttons and you kept from admitting you were wrong. You allowed emotion and instinct, the elephant, to override your reason. And that's the way that most of us operate most of the time. This was one of the big talking points for the 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who was an unrelenting pessimist. He didn't have this convenient metaphor of the elephant and the rider, but he explored the same concept. And as you can see, he used an awful lot of pages to do that exploration. His major work is called The World as Will and Idea. And I'm not going to even pretend that we can summarize this whole book in just a few minutes. In fact, I'm not sure I'd want to. But here's what Mr. Schopenhauer observed. There's a basic force that drives everything around us, from the lowliest plant to the most rational philosopher. And this force is something Schopenhauer called the will to survive and the will to reproduce. Now, when you and I hear the word will, most of us tend to think of a conscious, deliberate thought process. But Schopenhauer meant something deeper. He was referring to the basic instinct, the elephant, instead of the rider. And that, he says, is what drives everything. So, for example, we're pretty sure that plants and trees don't contemplate the future, but something still makes them do what plants and trees are going to do. They grow toward the sun. They convert daylight into sugar. They produce seeds so that we get another generation of plants. Nobody apparently plans this. Nobody sits down and educates the plants on how to do these things. It just happens, as if there's an invisible force, the invisible will of the universe pushing the process along. Now, of course, you and I are not plants, so we're different because you and I actually plan our day. In fact, we tend to plan our whole lives. We choose things like our occupations or our spouses or what we're going to do for a living or where we're going to live. Compared to plants, we live a very well-contemplated existence. Except that we don't. In hindsight, you'll notice that most of what happens to us is outside of our control. You might head into your early 20s full of optimism and enthusiasm, convinced that you've got the world by the tail, but get to the end of your life and look back, and it starts to look more like the world had you by the tail. Most of our time in this world is spent being reactive instead of proactive, and most of our reactions appear to be instinctual. I mean, I'd love to pretend that every decision I've ever made was driven by pure logic, pure foresight. But you and I know that's not true. The hardwiring in our brains that gets there during our early years and the basic instincts of day-to-day existence usually play a bigger role than calm, collected reflection. Now that's not always bad, because sometimes your gut instinct actually makes a better decision than your conscious brain, as Malcolm Gladwell pointed out in his best-selling book, Blink. But right now I've got to take a quick break, so stick around and I'll come back to show you what he says.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. So jump online now, or give us a call and start your journey of discovery.
This is Authentic with Sean Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Arthur Schopenhauer argued that most people operate by instinct instead of reason, and we find ourselves hopeless against the forces that just kind of seem to carry us along. Not that basic instinct is a bad thing, because sometimes it works better than your logic. Malcolm Gladwell tells the story of the famous Getty Museum and the day it bought a rare ancient statue in 1983. The statue looked remarkably well preserved. It appeared to be priceless, so they borrowed it and examined it meticulously for 14 months before agreeing to buy it. And wouldn't you know it, after all that careful deliberation, it was a fake. Something that one of their trustees actually said out loud the first time he saw the statue. Guys, something here doesn't feel right. So in that case, the elephant was more useful than the rider. The instinct was better than the logic. And so sometimes snap decisions actually prove to be better than careful deliberation. But that would only be true if the elephant is well trained, if your ingrained emotion actually matches the real world. Train up a child in the way he should go, the Bible says, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. This is why parenting is such a big responsibility, because how you train the elephant in the first couple of years is how your child is going to respond to the world for the rest of his or her existence. And once the elephant is powerful and fully grown, it's very hard to change direction because the elephant has a mind of its own. So back to Schopenhauer now, because when he looked at this battle between the unconscious forces that drive you in your logical mind, he essentially came to the conclusion that you and I don't have free will. He taught that human beings behave illogically because we are driven by the unconscious will to survive. One of the examples he gave is our drive to reproduce, to create endless new generations of human beings. He noticed that some life forms are willing to produce as their very final act. They actually die the moment they do this, like the salmon that swims upstream to the place where it was born and she lays her eggs and then falls apart. If you've ever seen a spawning salmon, you know what I'm talking about. It's grotesque. Human beings, Schopenhauer argued, aren't much different. We seem to be willing to exhaust ourselves, work ourselves to the bone to make sure that our children flourish. We have this irresistible drive to reproduce, and it appears to be illogical because we literally die in the process. So from Schopenhauer's point of view, the collective human race is actually using us. He taught that we are slaves to the mysterious will of the corporate human species, some kind of unseen will of the universe that makes us push forward against our own will. And that will override our logic every single time. So in essence, he taught that you don't actually exist. You live under the illusion that you're busy making choices, but in reality, the universe is making those choices for you and making it seem like you're doing it. In reality, you're just a pawn in the survival game of the whole human race. That, Mr. Schopenhauer argued, makes the world an evil place. At the very best, he said, you're going to spend the rest of your life just trying to avoid pain. And in trying to accomplish that, you're going to make a lot of irrational decisions, and, well, avoiding pain is about the only pleasure you can hope for. It's a pretty bleak point of view. Schopenhauer pointed to Dante's Inferno, which was a poetic description of hell, and he said, where did Dante get that? From the horror and pain of real life. But when it comes to describing heaven, we have to do that with our imagination. Now, I'm about to start picking Mr. Schopenhauer apart, but before I do that, let me tell you where I think he was right. There really is a powerful component to emotion, and there really is a force that drives us, sometimes against our will. You find this in the writings of the Apostle Paul, and I'm guessing you can probably identify with what I'm about to read. And we'll read quite a bit of this because it's important. Here's what he says. For what I am doing, I do not understand. For what I will to do, that I do not practice. But what I hate, that I do. So you have a situation where something keeps overriding your conscious choice. The elephant is more powerful than the rider. He continues. If then I do what I will not to do, I agree with the law that it is good. He's talking about the moral law of God. But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. So from Paul's perspective, the elephant has a name, and the name he gives it is sin. What the Bible teaches is that you and I are carried along by powerful forces beyond our control. Something has warped our original constitution, making us, well, completely malfunction. He continues, For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find. For the good that I will to do, I do not do. But the evil I will not to do, that I practice. So you see it again. The elephant always wins. Now, if I do what I will not to do, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. I find then a law that evil is present with me, the one who wills to do good. For I delight in the law of God according to the inward man. But I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members. O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? So what we have is Paul sitting on the elephant, and he can't seem to control it. His mind wants to obey God. He wants to do what's right, but the elephant is completely contrary to everything that God stands for. It refuses to move in God's direction because it's been trained by centuries of human rebellion to go in the wrong path. And if you think that you're going to retrain that ill-tempered elephant through sheer determination, well, you're in for a rude awakening because you're not strong enough. The only real hope you have is to get a new elephant, one trained by God Himself. And so we find Paul writing these words a little later in the same book. This is now over in Romans chapter 12. He says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Now here comes the big part. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed, how? By the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Okay, we've got to take another quick break because that's just the way things work here on the show. But when I come back, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about the way that you and I seem to always fail to conquer our temptations. And then I'll talk about what you could do about it.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon.
This is Authentic with Sean Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Jonathan Haidt's metaphor of the rider and the elephant is a really powerful illustration because, well, it is kind of how it works. For the most part, you and I have a lot of trouble overriding the basic instincts that just kind of seem to carry us along against our will. I mean, just think back to all the times you did the wrong thing. And come on, admit it, you've done the wrong thing. And you did it instinctually. You didn't plan to lose your temper. You didn't plan to treat somebody brutally. It just kind of happened in the flow of the moment. And after it happened, the tiny little rider of your reason looks back on what you did, and he goes full time trying to justify it. It's a miserable way to live. Now, the downside of hate's metaphor comes from the fact that it's born from an evolutionary perspective. Jonathan Haidt says the elephant is millions of years older than the rider, and so it's more deeply ingrained in your brain. Some people would call it the lizard brain, the part of your mind that operates by basic instinct. Somewhere along the way, Haidt argues, we developed into this higher, more self-aware being, and we developed a capacity for logic and reason. But that capacity for reason, he says, is a relatively new skill, so it's very weak compared to the elephant. Now, that's largely at odds with the way that the authors of the Bible describe the same phenomenon. According to this book, you were not designed as a slave to passion, and there really is such a thing as free will. In fact, once upon a time, we were made in the image of God with the capacity to learn about Him, to purposely and willfully become more like God, to reflect His perfect character. But then, in a deliberate act of free will, we chose a different path. We chose to untether ourselves from the one who made us. And so the rider pretty much warped the elephant. It was bad reasoning that led to the wrong instincts. And now we're driven by impulses that we were never originally supposed to have. The reason you and I get overpowered by instinct and emotion isn't because we've been evolving. It's actually the opposite. You and I are slaves to our passions because we've been devolving away from the original blueprint. And your twisted drive to do the wrong thing happened because we chose to corrupt our hearts and minds. So, now, you and I pass that badly programmed elephant on from one generation to the next. This is what Christians mean when they say we're all born sinners. And it's at least a tiny little part of what the Bible is referring to when it says that the sins of the fathers get passed down to the third and fourth generations. The authors of the Bible talk about our deepest nature, telling us that something went very wrong in the distant past. What we essentially did was climb down off of a healthy, well-tempered elephant designed by God. And then we climbed up on this ill-tempered, stubborn beast who is guaranteed to go the wrong direction. And because that ill-tempered elephant is bigger than you, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. So now the way we are, we can't really just trust our gut instinct, at least not when it comes to issues of morality, because our perspective has been tragically corrupted. And the more we try to tame ourselves, the more we try to rein in our very worst instincts, the more hopeless we start to feel because, well, the elephant's just too big. I don't know if you've ever tried to quit an addiction, like, say, smoking, but that's a pretty good example of how the elephant always seems to win. You know you should quit, logically. You know that it's killing you, and you can figure this out by reasoning your way through it. But your gut-level emotions are bigger and stronger than your logic, and so you find yourself back out on the back porch, lighting up yet another cigarette, and hating yourself for not being able to conquer something that appears to be bigger than you. That's why the Bible doesn't really talk about taming the elephant or taming your worst instincts. Instead, what this book talks about is letting God kill off the faulty elephant and just give you a new one. What the Bible suggests is not a retraining program, it's more of a replacement program. Here, listen to this, again from the writings of Paul. He says, "Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others." Now here comes the really mind-boggling part. He says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. So here we have an example of someone who was not controlled by sinful instinct. And Paul encourages us to follow Christ's example. Except you know full well that you're not going to be able to do that just through your own sheer willpower. There's no chance. It takes something more. What it actually takes is admitting that you're out of control. It takes confessing your sin and asking God for forgiveness. It takes asking God for a new set of guiding principles, basically a brand new elephant. And that requires a miracle, which is exactly what Paul teaches. Remember, but I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members. O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? I thank God, here it is now, through Jesus Christ our Lord. That's the only way out. I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. Bible prophecy can be incredibly vivid and confusing. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Our free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and our world. Study online or request them by mail and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Welcome back. It's Authentic with Sean Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
You know, I find it really interesting that the pessimistic philosophies that came out of the 19th century basically came on the heels of Charles Darwin. We halfway convinced ourselves that there's no God out there, but we still couldn't shake the notion that there's something wrong with the way we live, that just living by animal instinct doesn't produce a happy life. In fact, Arthur Schopenhauer actually pondered whether or not suicide was the only way to conquer this powerful force that just makes us so unhappy. Now, in that regard, I have to say Mr. Schopenhauer was completely wrong. You and I are flawed, but we can't fix it, not on our own. Fortunately, however, the master of elephants, the one who made us in the first place, well, he says he's got a way out of the mess. And I don't know about you, but if there's a way out of that miserable existence, if there's a way to feel some kind of control again, if there's a way to stop doing instinctively the things that I don't want to do, that seems to me it makes giving this old book worth a try. Why don't you pick it up and see what it says? I think it's a lot more profound than people think. It addresses the core of who we are. Thanks for joining me this week. I'm Sean Boonstra, and this has been another episode of Authentic.
You've been listening to Authentic, sponsored by Voice of Prophecy. Remember, you can listen every week right here at the same time. And thank you. Authentic is funded by listeners just like you. You can support at voiceofprophecy.com. That's also where you can find all the episodes you missed, or where you can listen again. That's voiceofprophecy.com.